Konnichiwa. This is the Filmlinks podcast, World Tour.
A special summer series where we explore filmmaking from around the world.
Watashi wa Jonathan.
Watashi wa Alex.
Kore wa shu 27 desu. Japan Juxtaposed.
Yep, that's right. We are back in Japan yet again. This time we are not talking about Kurosawa. We are not talking about cowboys. We are just talking about Japanese movies.
Right, and to be clear, we may talk about Akira Kurosawa, but we have not watched any of his films for this week. We're just watching other influential directors from Japan, some that relate more or less to Kurosawa, but others that are quite distinct.
That's right. We're going to be looking at some legendary Japanese filmmakers today who aren't Kurosawa, and some very interesting family drama. We didn't intend to put together a family drama theme week when we were looking at this Japanese episode, but holy crap, did we ever create a Japanese family drama themed week. And it is a very sad family drama themed week, so get a box of tissues when you watch these films, but they are good and they are worth a watch. Right.
So, like we said, we are trying to, for the world tour, pick a bunch of movies that we have not seen. So we unintentionally created the saddest week so far on the podcast, probably, even with the neo-realists in the mix.
Right. And it's especially come down after all of the bright shininess of the Indian episode last week. And all of the joy and the passion bursting at the seams to come to like this more subdued look at things. Well, subdued in two of our movies, not subdued in Harakiri at all. But but definitely in smaller films with a more serious and sometimes just straight up depressing look at the world.
Right. So specifically, what movies are we looking at today, Alex?
Well, first we're going to be talking about Harakiri by Kobayashi, Masaki Kobayashi. It might be flip-flopped. I still haven't gotten that down yet, but he is definitely a legendary Japanese filmmaker in the ranks with Kurosawa. We're also going to be talking about Tokyo Story by Yasujirô Ozu, which is another legendary filmmaker. And then we're going to be talking about Nobody Knows, maybe the most depressing movie of the bunch. Because, well, for reasons that we'll get to. But it was done by Hirokazu Koreeda, who is a contemporary Japanese filmmaker and legendary in his own right. Probably more legendary once he's dead, because that's how legends work. But I don't mean to be so morbid, but the films this week just put me in that mood.
Yeah, so the title Japan Juxtaposed kind of comes from this idea that we're juxtaposing Harakiri, which is a feudal Japanese samurai film like the Kurosawa films we've watched before, so there'll be a lot of comparison there. And then Tokyo Story and Nobody Knows, which are very similar in their conflicts of very heavy family conflicts from two different time periods in Japan, both modern time periods. So typically we'll talk about our films in their order of release, but this week we're going to start with Harakiri to kind of give us that transition out of Kurosawa and into some more modern set Japanese films. So with that being said, Alex, do you want to tell us what Harakiri is about?
I do, Jonathan. And yet again, I find myself wishing I knew a little bit more about Japanese history before talking about a film from Japan, because this one keys into a very specific time period in Japanese history. It seems when a lot of feudal lords and the samurais who were supported by those feudal lords suddenly up and vanished. So all of those, and by vanish I mean they didn't have, the lords weren't allowed to be lords anymore. So the samurais didn't mysteriously disappear. But suddenly you have a bunch of samurai on the street who are masterless, so now you call them Ronin, and they don't have any money. And this is the story of what happens to a couple of those samurai who go to one of the clans who are still in power and ask to commit ritual suicide, Harakiri, which loosely translated means slicing the belly or something like that. Something along those lines, because that's what harakiri technically is. It's
graphic but descriptive.
Open. Yeah, right. It is also called seppuku. That's the formal name for it. But it is ripping open the belly and then having your second chop your head off with a sword. So fun. But it was looked
sorry to be so graphic,
as,
but that's a very like specific and like important facet of this entire movie.
It is viewed as a more honorable way to die than starving to death or almost any other way besides dying in battle for a samurai, for someone of a samurai class. Keep in mind that the samurai were a social class as much as a warrior, so this kind of all tied together. And like many other Jidaigeki films, which are these period piece films, particularly about feudal Japan, it takes aim at that feudal order. So it's almost this thriller as a samurai, a ronin now, shows up at this clan and is like, hey, I want to commit harakiri here. And the clan is like, okay, but a lot of you ronin have been showing up at these clans like us, claiming you want to commit harakiri because your story is so sad, in hopes that we'll give you money and send you on your way so you don't kill yourself in our homes. And kind of forcing the samurai to try to prove that he wants to kill himself, and the samurai trying to prove that, except does he really want to do that? Motivations and backstories are revealed over the course of the film, and I really don't want to give anything away because it's a really good reveal to watch. But
there's a lot of moving elements. It's kind of hard to not spoil it because it's so complicated. It's really, I think you described it as like a classic noir film, and it really is, because it has those twists and turns, and the way that the story is revealed is so brilliant. We have this idea of a story within a story, where the first Ronin that we see shows up and is like, hey, I want to commit harakiri. And so the leader of the clan's like, oh, really? Let me tell you the story about this other guy who came to us and wanted to commit harakiri, and see if you still feel that way. And then later on, the Ronin is like, okay, well, let me tell you this story about my family and all this stuff. So a lot of the story takes place through flashbacks, and then what we learn in the flashbacks impacts the things that are being revealed in real time. And it's really well crafted narrative.
Oh yeah, it's incredibly intricate, and if nothing else, I feel like it's one of those films that is told out of sync, because you have this flashback timeline that keeps progressing throughout the film, to the point basically where you have what you said, a story within a story going on, and you could uncut those and have it all happen in order. Which is something that would happen 20 years before this film came out. That's how that story would have been told. But I think you get much more significance, and certainly a lot more tension and a lot more suspense out of revealing it in the order that they reveal it.
Right. And this film comes out quite a bit after Rashomon, which I believe was 52 or 53.
And this film came 50s. Out yeah, so it was about a decade after that.
Yeah, so I kind of wonder how much Rashomon helped pave the way for this kind of story that does tell the story in that back and forth, even though Rashomon had a little bit less of the story in the present being affected by, or our perception of the story being told in the present being affected by what we're learning in the flashbacks. It was mostly just us learning about the flashbacks in Rashomon.
Yeah, and Kobayashi and Ozu and Kurosawa, along with I'm sure a few others that I just don't know off the top of my head, kind of come together to make it's not a formal movement like the French New Wave, where you have a bunch of young guns together and like, we're gonna shake things up. But these directors, these Japanese directors, ended up launching a kind of Japanese golden age of cinema in the 50s and the 60s. Because Tokyo Story 2 comes out in 1953. And you're talking about this kind of new way of storytelling that was a big splash with Rashomon. But again, you see that order change up here in Harakiri, where you tell a story basically out of order and you flip-flop between two parallel storylines. And then you see that influence future cinema. Like, think about anything that Christopher Nolan does or Quentin Tarantino does, where it's out of sync and it's non-linear.
Right. And still within that, we're seeing this is a theme that will carry over to all of our films this week, is this very kind of technically meticulous and technically beautiful filmmaking, like we've seen with Akira Kurosawa. And I think, at least from the sample that we pulled from so far of Japanese films, seems to be quite a theme in Japanese film, and seems to be kind of a trademark of their art in general. Is it's very restrained. It's very, even though this film is bigger than the other two and has some action set pieces, it's still done in a very minimalistic and stylized way.
Yeah, and no one can shoot a outdoor scene better than these Japanese filmmakers of the 50s and 60s. We've seen plenty stocked to the brim, beautiful outdoor scenes in Kurosawa films, and you get quite a few here in Harakiri. There's a really great sword battle at one point. I won't tell you what point.
Yeah,
that's outside.
The climax of the movie.
Absolutely gorgeous. And it's just this, like you said, it's clearly is technical perfection. And it's not always just cloudy exactly right in Japan, although maybe it is. I don't know. I doubt it, though. That's not how filmmaking goes. Filmmaking is the art of dealing with many problems at once that keep popping up. So I don't think that was the case. I think this was a case of skill and, like you said, technical perfection and a emphasis on that within your filmmaking.
But alongside that, we have another discussion, kind of like what we had with Yojimbo and A Fistful of Dollars, is the fact that in the midst of this beautiful filmmaking and intricate narrative, it is a pretty brutal movie. I mean, this movie is about, like you said, slicing your belly open. And they don't shy away from it. I mean, even though it's done tastefully and yet still like gives you this really raw and visceral experience.
About as tastefully as it could have been done.
Right, as far as the script calls for.
Yeah. There's no like blood splatter on this lens or anything.
It's not Tarantino.
There's not like over the top squelching noises or something like that. Isn't that just a terrible word? Squelch. Anyway.
Squelching, yeah.
I hate it. Anyway. But it is really beautiful and at the same time incredibly vicious, and incredibly intense. Both the battles and the filmmaking around those battles. Completely precise and beautiful, but deadly. Not to get too weirdly poetic, because I'm bad at that and when I'm free speaking, but kind of like the way you would wield a katana.
Yeah, and another interesting thing about this film, especially as compared to the Kurosawa samurai films that we've seen, is this film it takes more dramatic liberties. There are certain times when he uses his cinematic style in a way that's not necessarily realistic, in a way that Kurosawa is a little bit more grounded in reality. So just as the first example, the opening of the film is we see this suit of armor that kind of represents the ancestors that the clan kind of prays to or pays homage to throughout the film, but it's very dark and like spotlighted with smoke all around it, and it's this very ominous feeling. And that's how we open, and then we go in other points of the film in order to emphasize the drama that's happening. We'll throw a spotlight and kind of drown the rest of the frame in darkness to just literally highlight what's going on. And it was something that's interesting because, like I said, Kurosawa doesn't do that as much. He doesn't call the filmmaking out, but Kobayashi doesn't feel any hesitation with that, and it actually does accent his story very nicely.
Yeah, it works perfectly for Harakiri. It's exactly what the film needs for this weird drama, pseudo mystery. film almost, where you don't
Yeah, a little
find
bit
out
of
what
mystery.
happens to the end. Yeah, think mystery in the same way that like Memento is a mystery.
Not that the characters are trying to figure out what happened, but that we are slowly piecing together a story that has happened before the story that we're watching.
Yeah. It's not like a cop drama or anything. It's just like you. One of the things that's most engaging about the film is that you're trying to put together exactly what happened, and as you might be one step or one ahead or behind of certain characters, you're engaged with trying to egg them on to the same conclusions you've reached, or you are trying to catch up to whatever they've just realized. It makes for a very interesting film to watch.
Yeah, and again, another contrast in this film has so many layers, there's so much going on, is that there is another side that's very sweet and very down to earth. It's this story of the family of the Ronin who we see at the very beginning, and we kind of follow as his daughter falls in love and gets married, and their family and their child, and then as they hit hard times and have to cope with that, and that is kind of sets the backdrop for the story that we're watching. But all of those moments were very sweet and very lighthearted. And then aside from that, we're seeing the first thing that we're seeing is the brutal and depressing outcome. So we're watching all of these sweet moments with this tinge, this grain of salt of, okay, I know where this is going, so I can't be too oohing and awing over it.
Yeah, it can't be too comfortable, too content with where you're at, because you know the bad times are coming. But we should talk about this idea of family drama and Japanese culture in this film. Because if you think about it, a clan is essentially a family, and a lot of this film not only centers around the in particular nuclear family of the Ronin, but also the larger clan politics that's at play, and the I don't know what the best way to describe it is, but like you said, with the suit of armor at the beginning, they revere and honor, and I don't know the particulars of ancestor worship, or if that's what's happening there. I'd have to do a lot more research to find that out, but there definitely
At
is
least honoring.
Yeah, there definitely is like a generational honoring that happens within this film, and the sense of heavy responsibility and respect for your family that you see within this film, and I feel like you see in the other two films today. And I don't think that is in particular a Japanese thing by any stretch of the imagination, like unique to Japan, but it is interesting to see it because we accidentally struck upon this family theme to see it strung out across 3 Japanese films, and it's an interesting piece of cultural tourism to experience that much exploration of what family means in Japan.
Right. And I think that there is something to be said about, Japan's reverence for genealogy and stuff like that, because, clearly there's a little bit more of that awareness there within those kind of cultural things than maybe in American film or just American life. We maybe look up where we came from on ancestors.com sometimes, but other than that, it's not like we have these shrines and monuments to remind us of the people who came before us as much as seems to permeate the Japanese culture. And that's, like you said, that's something that we found in all 3 of these films, so it's something we want to bring up. And we've even seen it in some of the other Kurosawa films, like in Yojimbo, where you have the 3 brothers and the 2 clans fighting over each other over, loyalty to themselves. And also in Seven Samurai, where you have the band of farmers who are all, kind of quarreling within themselves, but trying to stick together. They just don't have the means to protect themselves, so they have to go out. And maybe that's why this idea of Ronins and samurais who are disconnected from a family is so interesting or is such a big part of Japanese art and stuff, because that's kind of an outlier. That's an interesting thing to observe.
Yeah, it always does seem to be a Ronin that these films focus on. It's never a just your standard employed retainer. But all film does tend to deal in fantasy or the fantastical. So a Ronin, I guess, is also inherently more interesting than
if you could focus on one hero,
employed samurai, I guess.
Right.
So on to the next Japanese film of this week, Tokyo Story from 1953. Jonathan, do you want to tell us what that one is all about?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. It's a pretty straightforward story, and the interest of it comes from the way that it's presented. But basically, it's about this older Japanese couple who lives in this small town in the country, and they live with their youngest daughter, but they travel to Tokyo, obviously the big city, this very hustle bustle, very different than the life that they're used to, and they go visit each of their other children. And so we kind of follow them through this journey, and each one ends up realizing that they don't have time for their parents, essentially, and finding a way to shuffle them off onto the next kid, or kind of get them out of the way until the parents go back home. And it's a very sad story, but it's very poignant. It's very poetic, I guess. Yeah,
it really is. And I'm glad you stopped, because we don't want to spoil anything.
Yeah, I'm trying not to spoil the end.
But this is, I do want to take a second before we get too far into Tokyo Story and talk about something, because I've been throwing around these terms, and I think you have too, for the past couple of weeks, but we haven't really explained it. And when we talk about big filmmaking and small filmmaking, and kind of the spectrum between the two of them, and when we say this is a really good time, essentially, to stop and give a good example, because Tokyo Story is a really great example of small filmmaking. It is focused in on a small group of people, a little more mundane almost, versus big filmmaking, which just go back an episode and listen to the section on Bahubali, and you know what big filmmaking is.
That's a big movie.
Yeah. And there's no precise line between the two, but there is a scale, and it is interesting to see how things tend to be treated on one end of the spectrum versus the other. But I just wanted to take a moment and throw that out there. So just when people hear me talking weird random terminology that I kind of applied to things myself, I want it to be understood what I mean. I'm by no means trying to say that this is a big deal movie versus this is a small deal movie. That's what I'm scared of people thinking. I don't want anybody to think that I'm disparaging any movies by calling them small. They're really.
Yeah, but the other thing to clarify is that also doesn't necessarily have any bearing on, like, what the budget is or how many people were involved. Smaller films tend to have a smaller budget and a smaller need for people and stuff, but typically the term refers to the subject matter. So it's about a family. It's a very intimate subject matter. It's about a couple people and their emotional connection to each other, as opposed to this is about an entire country, or this is about a nationality, or very much broader kind of themes and goings on. Like in Bahubali, it was an adventure, so he's traveling through all these different places and meeting these different people and that kind of thing. So naturally, it tends to have more people involved and more money needed to create that, but it's not a necessity. So it's more about the themes and the subject matter than necessarily the production or even the length of the film. Like Tokyo Story is 2.5 hours. It's about as long as any really long action film also.
True. And I'd also say that something I've noticed over the past couple weeks, because we've been bouncing back and forth between big and small movies a lot, is that big movies tend to be more about escapism and smaller movies tend to be more about relatability. Not that they are mutually exclusive or that a small film isn't escapist and a big film can't be relatable. But when I watch Bahubali or Lord of the Rings, I'm not like, wow, this reminds me of that time I carried a ring to a volcano. I'm like,
Right.
wow, this is really fun. And I forgot about the real world for like 3 hours and really enjoyed a film.
But when you watch Tokyo Story, you're like,
When I watch
man, I
Tokyo
should
Story,
call my mom.
I'm like, man, I should really talk to my mom today, which I will actually, like right after this, but not the point. Hi,
Mom.
But that is, hi, shout out to my mom. Thank you, Mom the Filmlings, for raising us to really like movies.
Good movies. Yeah.
Yeah, good movies.
Anyway.
Shout out over. Discussion about big and small movies over. Now back to Tokyo Story. A really great small movie that was long and about moms and how you should spend time with yours.
But it was about a lot of other kinds of family dynamics also, not just child and parent, even though that was kind of the crux of the film. But through that, we get a lot of other things. We get, sibling relationships. We get grandparent-grandchild relationships. We get in-law relationships. The in-law relationship ends up being more important than the actual blood sibling or blood children relationship, and that's kind of a big part of the film.
Because the blood children are, they're not terrible, but they are kind of absorbed in their own lives.
Right, but it's this thing where you kind of understand where they're coming from, and you're like, man, do I do that? Is that like, how can I kind of avoid that? And that's one of the powerful things about this film, is that it makes you take a look inside yourself and be like, man, where does that reflect me? And how do I not be like these people necessarily? Because they weren't being mean to their parents or anything. They just were really busy people. They just didn't make an extra effort to be with their parents as they should have done. Yeah.
They didn't put it into a larger context of the value. They didn't. Maybe the best way to put it is they didn't put as much value on visiting their parents as their parents put on visiting them, and that ended up being hurtful for their parents, and by the end of the film, quite tragic. So. Right. Like we said before, this is really a film that makes you want to call your mom. So, unlike Nobody Knows, which is maybe the opposite. But
right. But we'll get there.
There.
The other thing about Tokyo Story is that, and another thing sometimes that applies to smaller films more than bigger films, is that it's not an exciting movie. It's a movie that's a portrait of life, and it's very slow paced. It kind of drifts by, kind of a thing. You almost get the sense that it's coming from the perspective of the grandparents, and it's this very slow and almost like another theme in the film is this idea of the train that takes them from the country to the city. And so almost in the way that the country passes by in the windows of a train while you're sitting on it, the film kind of carries you from one scene to the next, and it just shows you each scene, and as the scenes go by, a fuller picture of the landscape comes together.
Yeah, it's not like a bunch of exciting events that happen. Like I wouldn't really say anything that happens in the film is exciting until like the very end, which is maybe not a great pitch for the film. But
yeah, exciting still isn't the word I would use at the end.
That's true. Maybe depressing, but it is emotionally engaging, and it's so relatable. And that's maybe the strength of small films in general, is that they tend to be so darn relatable, even if you don't relate to a particular large experience of somebody's life. Once you boil somebody's life down to small enough bits, some of those bits are gonna match. Like parents, like most people have parents. Right. Actually, everybody has parents, even if you've never met them. Parents. Everyone has them. They exist. I don't think there's clone babies yet. I don't think we've gone there. I don't know. Discussion for a different podcast.
We've talked about that before. The idea that, the more universal and personal your theme is, the more it's going to stick with people. And this film has stuck with so many people.
Yeah, it is one of those legendary films. It's in the Criterion, so all of your hipster friends like us can enjoy it. But it is one of those things that just slowly becomes emotionally engrossing over the course of the film as you watch it. And then easily by the 30-minute, 40-minute mark of the film, and it's a 2.5-hour film, you're wrapped up in these characters' lives. And there's no there's no upfront explanation about anybody's situation within the film. Nobody leans over to the other character and is like, do you remember when this happened to that character? As a nod, wink to the audience of here's all the backstory you'll need. But you're really just you're stuck trying to suss out what the relationships are between these characters and how do they know each other and which one of these adults are their kids again? Which is what I was mention over the course of the film.
Yeah, like you said, they're not like, oh, hi, brother. Oh, hello, mother. Hello, mother-in-law, to give us an easy way to piece together this family tree. And that's almost one of the things that keeps you in the film is trying to piece all the people together. It's almost like you're going to someone else's family reunion and just observing and trying to figure out how everyone's are related to each other
and what the relationship between those people are. Yeah, there's no Wes Anderson style introductions for each character,
titles for each person.
Yeah, and I might have just said that so I can get Wes Anderson into yet another podcast. But
I think there is some valid comparison with Wes Anderson and Tokyo Story. We actually
actually we found a lot of stuff on that this week.
Yeah, we have a video essay that we will include in the blog post that kind of talks about this comparison because, as we talked about in the Wes Anderson episode, a lot of his themes have to do with parent-child relationships and this idea of often his films will bring these families together through adversity, whereas Ozu kind of shows the drifting apart of families due to various circumstances, this one being just distance and busyness of life.
Yeah, and time and just the growing apart that happens over the course of life as you move from this phase of your life to that phase of your life to that phase of your life. And, part of it while you're watching it is this weird internal struggle of you're like, that isn't going to happen to me, but it might. Right. There's a reason that it's so relatable. Because it happens to almost everybody. You move to a different life phase and you drift apart from your family a little, maybe. And granted, this is in the 1950s, so it's not like you can play words with friends with your mom, right. In across time zones.
If you still play words with friends.
Right. I actually just recently started again because I could, and my mom was like, do you want to play Words with Friends? So we started playing Words with Friends.
We'll have to start a game.
Yeah, I like how my mom has become a subtopic of this episode. Interesting. Anyway, back in 1953, Japan, they probably lived within 50 to 100 miles of Tokyo, and going to see each other was just unfeasible on a regular basis. Because you had to travel by train, and train was probably really expensive back then.
It takes a long time.
It takes a really long time. The parents are old, and it's hard to get around. Long distance travel is a wear on the body, and just the reasons just keep adding up and keep adding up and keep adding up, and then by the end, you're stuck not seeing each other as often as you'd like to, and you keep making excuses for it. And you find yourself stuck in this trap and growing apart.
And another element of the filmmaking in Tokyo Story that will help transition us into our next movie is how grounded in reality this movie feels, as opposed to Harakiri, where Kobayashi used a lot of stylistic elements and, showed that it was a movie and used the movie techniques to emphasize his points. Tokyo Story basically just sets up each shot as a painting or a photograph, and then just kind of lets the action happen within that, and then we cut to another one, and it's almost all locked down shots, I think, and it's very still, and it's just the acting is very natural, and it literally feels like you're just watching somebody's life happen, and it doesn't feel like a documentary in the way that we're accustomed to nowadays, because our cameras are much more unencumbered, like we talked about a couple weeks ago, nowadays. But it feels like we're almost like a cross section of a dollhouse, and just watching these people's lives through this little window that is Ozu's camera.
Yeah, it has that fly on the wall almost feel about it. And I do want to mention, both in Tokyo Story and Harakiri, and this is something that I noticed in Kurosawa, and I talk about a lot in Kurosawa, but the framing and where you put just the composition of the shot is phenomenal in all three of those films, but especially in Tokyo Story. They use the idea of a doorway and what at least I see as the unique layout of a Japanese house versus the kinds of house that you would find in the U.S. or like Western Europe or something like that. They use that kind of a house, that Japanese house, to really emphasize their framing. Foreground, midground, background.
Yeah,
so
it's
often
very angular, so it fits in the square frame of a camera lens very well.
Perfectly, and you end up with this looking through this doorway feel all the time, and it's almost that Wes Anderson dollhouse feel, but it's not like a cut open set either. It feels like they're within a house, and they're just shooting through doorways for perfect effect, which makes it again feel like you're really there, like you're just looking through the doorway to see what's happening in the other room.
Right, but not quite as much as the next film, which also has very good framing, but in a little bit different way.
A very different way.
Do you want to set us up for Nobody Knows, Alex?
That depends. Do you want to cry?
No, but I couldn't help it this week.
It's okay. It's okay. It's sad. So Nobody Knows is a story about the world's worst mother, except not about her. It's about her kids. She has about 4 kids, 2 sons, 2 daughters, and she is kind of flighty. She's had all these children by different dads, and none of them are still in the picture, and she's been moving them from house to house. When they move into a new apartment at the start of this film, she literally sneaks 2 of her children into the apartment by suitcases, because she isn't allowed to have that many people live in the apartment. And she leaves for long periods of time too. She'll leave for like a couple weeks at a time, for a month at a time, until about 30 minutes into the movie. And this is still pretty early in the film, so I don't feel like I'm spoiling it. This is the main conflict of the film. She leaves like forever. Like she just doesn't come back. And the kids are left to their own devices. And the protagonists of the film, well, all the children are technically protagonists, but the main protagonist is the oldest son, Akira. We have another Akira on the podcast.
Another Akira,
but in less shiny of a setting, because it's about child abandonment. And maybe the worst thing about the whole deal is it's based on a true story that actually happened, and in the true story, it was actually worse than what happened in Nobody Knows. So
we'll include a link to an article that explains that.
Just read the Wikipedia page. Okay. It's the Sugimura, something like that, child abandonment case. It is not pleasant at all. And neither really is the situation within this film. But again, turning it back to this idea of family, because both of the previous films had this idea of what do you do in your respect, in your requirement, your responsibility to other generations within your family. And this is a generation left to its own, cut loose from a family entirely. So it's just these four kids all in the same generation. And how do they survive? And how does this oldest child, who's only like 12, by the way, take on that responsibility and try to keep his brother and sisters alive?
Yeah, and like we were saying with Tokyo Story feeling very grounded in reality, Nobody Knows is almost presented like straight documentary style. Like if you didn't know that it was a fiction, you might assume that it was a documentary. And that's not to say that the film is...
I mean, the film looks like it was shot on mini DV tape, but...
Right, and that's not to say that like any of the framing or anything is unintentional, because there are some very intentional compositions and some very striking shots and poignant moments, but it's very fly on the wall, like especially with the way that they do close-ups and like little singling out of things and just kind of jumping around, and it doesn't narrate the story to you or anything. It just kind of presents this situation that these kids find themselves in. And I will say that all the kids gave great performances. They all did really well, which I assume can be very difficult. The first rule of filmmaking is don't work with kids or animals because they're just so hard to control. But Koreeda is able to, use these four kids to a great effect, and they all work really well off of each other. And they all feel incredibly natural. They don't feel like they're playing to the camera or anything. It was really amazing.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that Koreeda has kind of made a career out of. And all three of our filmmakers today probably will end up deserving their own episodes later on in the future. But in the case of Nobody Knows, it's just so... I would actually call it gritty. Especially as the film progresses and it gets dirtier and dirtier. And like you were talking about, literally singling out specific shots. Yeah, literally. They update us on as to the I guess situation, the status, the care of each character by showing these repeated close-ups of characters' shoes and characters' fingers and hands, and showing them as they get dirtier and more tattered over the course of the film.
Yeah, one thing that was interesting to me to see between Tokyo Story and Nobody Knows is the way that the Japanese culture has shifted in those 50 years, almost exactly 50 years apart. Because Tokyo Story is still, the culture is holding on, kind of like in America in the 50s, where you kind of think of people still wearing suits and acting in a very proper and traditional way. That's what you get in Tokyo Story. You have everyone comes in, they take their shoes off, they sit down and very polite, offer tea and that kind of thing. And then in Nobody Knows, it's quite different. It's more casual, but the things that are left over are interesting. Like they still take their shoes off, and there's a little point at the entryway of the apartment where you leave your shoes and that kind of thing. So seeing that contrast, that juxtaposition, if you will, again, going back to the title and theme of this episode, was really interesting to watch from the perspective of an outside culture.
Yeah. Although the shoes thing is just like an East Asian thing in general. Like that's a...
Right, but specifically watching it in these films, because it's still not something that's pervasive in our culture.
Although it should be. Why do we wear shoes inside? What are we, monsters? Come on.
Got to be ready to beat a retreat.
Gosh, sorry. I'm going to get down off my soapbox and go back to the film now. Yeah, so it is definitely a unique slice of life, and one that is very different than Tokyo Story. And I think something to keep in mind on both is that you're working with a very limited source on each. You're not getting the full spectrum of what culture could be like in 1953 versus 2004, obviously, but you do see changes, and they are worth looking at, and they are interesting to juxtapose And not just because juxtaposition is in the title of this week's episode, but because juxtaposition, as we'll talk about in a couple weeks where we go to a certain country, is the source of created meaning.
And like I was saying before, the film is very symbolic, and it uses a lot of foreshadowing and things that you don't think of as foreshadowing, as good foreshadowing should be, until the event actually happens. So, for example, like dropping a plant off of a windowsill. It seems kind of innocent until, you understand the larger context of the film itself. And there are some things, like even in the composition, there's a composition of two characters sitting in the grass with a suitcase beneath them, and an airplane just flies directly overhead of them, which, if you don't know the context, is just, it's kind of a nicely put together shot, but it's actually incredibly meaningful. Or another shot of an airplane that is leaving, and it actually hits like the exact corner of the frame.
Yeah, and stuff like the repeated shots of the shoes take on more meaning as the film goes on. And like we were saying with Tokyo Story, of course the stakes seem higher throughout Nobody Knows, but there's nothing in particular exciting happening throughout the early parts of the film. There's just a lot of really sad things happening throughout the early parts of the film. But as you get invested in these characters' lives, and as you see added things happen to them, you become engrossed in the film, and you care about the film, and you exit reality, our reality, if you believe in reality, and you enter the world of the film, and you exist there. And that's always a strong sign of a really good film, is if you've ever watched a movie and suddenly realized that a lot of time has passed, or you're like, oh yeah, this isn't the real world. Or if you pause it and you go away from a second and you're really upset about whatever's happening in the film, that's a good sign of a film. And if you want a film that'll leave you feeling really upset, Nobody Knows is a good one.
Or any of these three.
Or any of these three, really. But especially with Nobody Knows, because like we've been talking about with all of this foreshadowing that we've been mentioning, and we've been walking on eggshells with it, because obviously we don't want to spoil the film, because the end is kind of shocking. But going back to like the Cornetto trilogy week with Edgar Wright, where we say, go back and rewatch these movies and rewatch them because the foreshadowing is so interesting. I feel like Nobody Knows could be a really great candidate for that. If you ever felt like crying, like if you're like, I really need a good cry right now, I'll watch Nobody Knows again. But I don't feel the same way about the foreshadowing. I feel like thinking about it after I've watched that movie and not experiencing it again, because it was really good and really effective. But sadly, like I said, that effect was making me very sad. So
yeah, either if you want to be sad or incredibly angry at neglectful parents.
Yeah, geez. Oh, it is not easy.
There's a lot of rage that happens at the beginning of this movie.
No, you're
inside of the audience.
Yeah, the mom is pretty awful. She's pretty awful, and there's a lot of bad movie parents because they're made by filmmakers, and the vast majority of people don't end up liking their parents too much. I'm willing to bet on that.
But she's not evil stepmother bad.
She's just purely neglectful. I mean, that's her thing. She's so self-absorbed that she doesn't pay attention to the children, and she just jets, maybe literally, and never comes back.
Yeah.
And especially once you read up on the real actual case that happened, and you're like, wow, some human actually did this, actually let this happen to their children. Like, wow. And it's not even within the realm of you can find a way to make apologies for this parent. Like, no, what she did was terrible and self-centered and awful, and it's completely okay to hate her, because you will by the end of the movie, or 5 minutes into the movie for the fact. 5 minutes into the movie, when she was pulling her kids out of suitcases, I was like, I am done with this woman. Like, Wow.
Yeah, there's no amount of like trying to reward them and having fun with them kind of makes up for that.
No.
Because she does, she goes through all the manipulation steps of, trying to give them treats and then trying to say that they're the ones that are being selfish and saying that she deserves to be happy. And you're like, no, you deserve to take care of your children, lady.
Yeah. But we need to vent about that, I think, and also brace those of you who have yet to watch this film for it. But like we said, it is really good, and it is worth a watch if you want to see a different kind of filmmaking than you're used to, because it's not your everyday kind of filmmaking. It definitely is.
And like we talked about in Italian neorealism, there is a place for these sadder stories. Not everything has to be American, everyone lives happily ever after. And the fact that this, like you've been talking about, does come from a real case gives it a lot of meaning and makes it an important thing to watch and just be aware that this happens to people in the world. And it kind of like it broadens your awareness of the kind of children who need help, because the other thing about the movie is Akira doesn't want to like tell the authorities or anyone about their situation, that their mom left and stuff, because then they'll all be sent to some kind of state-sanctioned shelter where they'll be broken up and they won't be able to be together. And he says we've done that before and it's just terrible. It's a big mess. And so it raises awareness of how bad we are as the people who are outside of that experience at taking care of the people who are in that kind of need, who are, for lack of a better word, the victims of people like the mother who are so concerned with their own life that they would neglect their children who really need the care.
Yeah, and that kind of is the significance of the title of this film, because I was wondering that halfway through. I was like, what does this title have to do with anything in this film? And the point is, nobody knows. Nobody knows that these children are going through this struggle. Nobody knows what really happened in the actual case, because everything is so covered up. I mean, literally all the kids in the actual case are referred to as Kid A, Kid B, Kid C, Kid D, and Kid E. So none of these characters are one-to-one to those characters. Nobody knows. It all
and the film
makes
makes
mysterious.
a special acknowledgement of that.
Yeah, as the sad thing is, as most bad things that happen to children, nobody knows, and that's scary. And that's one of the most strongly affecting things about this film, and small filmmaking in general, is when it hits home, it really hits home. And you don't have to have had to experience like this to feel that empathy or sympathy or whatever the correct term for it is, to feel pain about it, or to feel sorry about it, or to feel that it's suddenly real, because of all of the effective filmmaking techniques and rhetoric and all that jazz that we love to talk about all the time, that just makes the experience of watching the film so affecting.
Yeah, so that's all just to say that we've kind of built it up as this super depressing film. Like, why would anyone want to watch that? But it's still a really important film that it exists and that people see it, because it changes your outlook in a lot of ways, even if it doesn't leave you with a happy-go-lucky feeling in your stomach when you leave it.
Yeah. And to be fair, some people like being sad. Some people like watching and reading and listening to sad things. And I've definitely been in moods before, like, how you might be in a mood for Chinese at the time, or for like Italian or whatever. Food, I mean, not movies, although maybe movies. But like, I've definitely been in the mood where like, I don't want to watch anything happy right now. I just want to watch something sad. And well, here's another sad movie for that list. So.
Yeah. So add all three of these to that list.
Right.
All right. But with that, let's go into our overall notes and talk about things that we saw in all three of these, and maybe tie in our Akira Kurosawa films, which we've been mentioning the Akira Kurosawa films, but if you want to find out which episodes we talked about him in, you can find those in any episode with samurai in the title. We have 3 Samurai in Sombreros episodes and 1 Samurai in Space episode where we compare Akira Kurosawa to several Western films.
Samurai in Space.
If you want to hear Alex do that again, find that episode.
I do that a lot. I'm sorry. Oh, gosh. If you guys only knew how many stupid things I said that Jonathan has to cut out of this podcast every week. So many stupid
We would
things.
have another podcast.
We would have another podcast.
The blooperlings.
Oh my gosh. Is there anything else we could ling?
I'm sure we'll find something.
Oh, there's so many things. Although I do want to mention a couple of the things one thing that I noticed. We already talked a lot about the cultural comparisons of the experience of family through the lens of Japan in these 3 films. But I do want to mention food, because there's a lot of food in these 3 films, especially in like Tokyo Story and Nobody Knows. There's a lot of food.
Well, there wasn't enough food, and Nobody Knows at some point.
That's true. That's true. But there's a lot of eating, even though it's not like great food.
Right.
But I think that's a key factor, a key thing in the experience of family. And it's actually something that I found really relatable, because that's something that you grow up doing with your family all the time, is eating. And
breaking
that's what
bread,
you see.
if you will.
Breaking bread, yeah. And that's something that you see in Tokyo Stories, that they're like always eating. And same thing in Nobody Knows, even though the thing in Nobody Knows is it's kind of a parody on that situation. A sick parody, but a parody,
right, where one of the
satire on the
kids
situation.
At some point is eating ramen noodles dry because their water has been shut off, and so he's just like crunching down on these noodles, and you're like, that's so sad.
Yeah. You see the family tent pole, the family centerpiece of breaking bread together slowly deteriorate over the course of the film. But you also see it in Tokyo Story too.
Yeah, and as you're describing that, it actually kind of brings me back to the Buñuel episode and the fact that we found so many dinner parties in all of those movies, and it's kind of, he was parodying that because in the bourgeois society that he was living in, kind of that breaking bread together had a very artificial feel, and people put on a lot of airs and stuff like that in order to be accepted in society, and that was one of the events that you have to be on your best behavior for and all that kind of stuff. But here in these films, it's a much more intimate experience, and it's a much more it's where you kind of open up to your friends. It's where in Tokyo Story we see the parents are finding old friends that they've had and reminiscing over food and drink and connecting with their children and stuff like that. And then in Nobody Knows, it's where the children, either with their mom or eventually just with themselves, are connecting and talking about their day and that kind of thing. And so it brings a different light to it that does, as we've been talking about with the big and small films, it keeps it very small and personal and intimate, because it is, again, an experience that everybody can relate to.
Right. And they are these really intimate, relatable meals that you have, whether it's a cup of ramen noodles or just like a family dinner versus like a grand feast or something of the sort that you'd see in a big film.
So again, as we've kind of been talking about across all of these films, is how kind of restrained and intentional all of the filmmaking is. Like, it's very minimal and intentional what is put in the frame. Even in Nobody Knows, where the camera is a little bit more free-flowing and all over the place, it's still showing us very specific items at a time, like we were talking about with the cutaways, where it'll show close-up on a face or a hand or a shoe, or just little things like that to kind of imply the the gravity of the situation. And kind of one way that I would describe all of the films this week, and kind of, I guess, Japanese film in general, based on my experience with it, is very poetic in the way that they think about and tell their stories.
Yeah. I mean, especially in the older films from the Golden Age, the 50s and the 60s, with Harakiri and Tokyo Story, everything is so precise, like you were saying, the lighting, the camera movement, especially the blocking. I was always really impressed with the blocking in Kurosawa and how well he lines everyone up exactly in the frame where he wants them to be.
Right.
And not just to create a pretty shot, but often to create meaning with the geometry between where you have characters positioned. And you see that too in Harakiri and Tokyo Story. I mean, Harakiri has like a super crazy sword fight towards the end of it that takes place all over the main setting, and it is perfectly choreographed, and everybody hits their marks, and everything is super well lit and beautiful, and exactly what you would expect from an uber precise 1950s Japanese film.
And again, I think that's kind of a reflection of like Japanese art in general. I mean, Japan is where we get the haiku, which is such a like perhaps the most precise form of poetry that you can think of. And especially like you're talking about, those classical directors have that mindset and that kind of just cultural approach to art flows into their films, and it's really beautiful and fairly unique to that culture, and is why it's so striking to us Americans who kind of like we were talking about with India last week, like bigger is better. And it is a really big contrast to India last week, because everything was so flamboyant and big and exciting that you see the flip side of what cinema can be here this week, because even though it's smaller, it's still just as striking and poignant.
Yeah, and that there is no, neither one is particularly better than the other, but there is a time and place for each. And these family centric, very intimate stories feel like they're on the small scale are feel like they're better suited to this small filmmaking, this small restrained filmmaking. Whereas something like Bahubali, which I do want to be honest, does have families a big part of it at the center, but it's less of a family tale, more of an epic tale. I mean,
right, and the fact that the family is a royal family.
yeah,
plays
like
into
they're the royal family of an epic mythical Indian kingdom in something CE. Like it's different than just being like an average middle class family in Tokyo, Japan.
Yeah, but yeah, like you were saying, and like we've been saying throughout the last couple of weeks, is that, you know, there is a place in film art for all different kinds of experiences, and the more that you know about, the more, like, you know, whatever mood you were in, like you were saying with your different tastes at different times, you know where to go to get a specific type of art to experience at whatever time you're at. But you can't limit yourself to American film. And that's what I'm learning. We're only like halfway through the world tour, but that's the biggest thing that I've taken away, is that nobody should only be consuming American film, because you're missing out on so much.
Yeah, especially if you are a cinephile or are even kind of remotely curious and making some of your own content, your own art one day. It's important to see how more people than just those around you produce things, because there's so many good things out there, and so many different techniques and so many different styles that you wouldn't experience otherwise. And comparing all of those, juxtaposing all of those, is a great way to learn about them and learn when to use this technique and you learn when to use that technique.
Yeah, and beyond, you know, artistic research purposes, if you're just a person who consumes film, then, branching out from the films made in your native culture is also really important because it just broadens your horizons and your understandings of how other people live in different parts of the world in a really safe and comfortable way. That you just have to experience it and experience how they tell stories. And it's, it's just been a really enlightening experience for me so far. And I'm definitely planning to kind of shift my my ratio of American to foreign films just for my general viewing experience from now on.
Right. And it is a lot cheaper than a plane ticket.
Yeah, no kidding. And there's so much international film on even on Netflix or as we plugged a couple weeks ago with Filmstruck, Harakiri and Tokyo Story are both on Filmstruck if you want to go check those out.
Oh yeah,
there's such an easy way to just
on Filmstruck.
Right. It's so easy to get access to those films. You go to your local library. Even local movie theaters will play some of the bigger films, like Bahubali 2 was playing in some of the American theaters for a limited time. So just find out when that's happening and go check it out.
Yep. You'll appreciate different kinds of film more, and you might come away with it with a bigger appreciation for the films you were already watching too. Okay, Jonathan. So what are we going to talk about next week?
Next week, we are traveling back, coming a little bit closer to home, our neighbors in our home state of Texas in Mexico. And we'll be watching the films Macario from 1960, Amores Perros from 2000, and Pan's Labyrinth from 2006, the famous Guillermo del Toro epic. Well, it's not really an epic, it's a myth. But it's very interesting, and we will have lots to talk about in Mexico.
Yeah, it'll certainly be an interesting look at a film market that I don't think comes to a lot of people's minds right away, but has definitely generated a lot of really interesting and really high-quality content that we want to take a look at.
Yeah, and not to mention that Mexico has also produced several directors who have since moved to the United States and have become very big in the Hollywood market, including Alfonso Cuarón, who directed Gravity and Children of Men and Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, and also Alejandro Inarritu, who directed The Revenant and Birdman, and also Amores Perros, which is on the list for next week. So lots to talk about. Fairly overlooked, I feel like, but very influential.
Yeah, we're helping to experience a film market that we have not had a lot of experience with, a lot like we did with India, but also to bring to front a source of really great films and really great art to anybody else out there who is looking for new sources of great film and great art that they didn't know about already or didn't have experience with. And it should be a worthwhile time, like all of our weeks on the world tour have been. It should be a lot of fun to watch and a lot of fun to talk about, and I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
Well, that's about all the time we have in Japan for now.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.wordpress.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next week.
All right, I will see you in Mexico.
Oh, crap. Sorry, I'll be right back.
Okay. You good?
Yeah, I accidentally put my foot in a cockroach trap.
Jeez. You really put your foot in it this time.